Welcome to the first episode of the UCA POG Play&Pod podcast featuring me, UCA POG Dan.
I'm UCAPOG Lucas.
Yeah, and this is the uncomfortable beginning of the first episode. The intent of this kind of content is you should be able to either watch this kind of content or listen to it without watching it and get a similar level of enjoyment. That's the goal, at least. We'll see if we can achieve that.
90% of the time I'm like watching a video on Magic or a Twitch stream and I'm just hearing triggers go off and whatever the streamer is go like, oh wow, look at this. Oh, that's crazy. I 100% don't want to have to pull up my phone, look at the actual video and understand what's going on in a split second.
But we're going to start off today with a standard deck tech from the standard metagame challenge last week. This is Lucas's deck. I don't believe in standard from a idealistic standpoint.
Resident standard expert, UCAPOG Lucas on the case. So last week was the standard metagame challenge, and I had to throw together a deck that could possibly win in the challenge, make a little bit of cash, get a few packs, open some cards. I'm still short on a bunch of rares from the new set. So
did any of that happen?
Yes, actually. A lot of that happened.
Hell yeah.
Did not make the 7 wins, though. I only had time to play twice and got 4 wins before a loss both times. Unfortunate.
That's pretty good, though. I mean, remind me of what the metagame challenge was. It's just a regular, it's banless. Not banless, but it's just the regular ban rules and everything.
Yeah, it's the regular ban rules. It's best of 3. The trick is you have to play 7 best of 3 games and win all of them before you lose a single game. So it's not 7-2 like most of the events for best of 1. It's not 5-3 like some of the best of 3 events, which is nuts. It's very restrictive with how you can get to the end. But the big prize is you can win like 30 packs and make your cash back.
Yeah, wow, I remember. I think I did a couple of games, and I remember the prizes and payouts are pretty good.
Oh yeah, and it's so cheap to get in. You might as well register.
Right. Yeah. Let's get into it though. What did you end up playing?
Yeah, so I picked up Grixis. I would have played Jund. I do think it's the best deck, but I didn't have the wild cards for Jund since it's leaning so heavily into like the Reanimator theme. So I just stuck with what I knew, the Grixis Vampires, sort of grindy Grixis gameplay. And for this, I had 4 different 1-mana interaction spells. Duress, Cut Down, Rona's Vortex, Voltage Surge, all because they hit different things. They ended up being okay. It's kind of tough to target a lot of stuff with the different modes of this. I mean, the Voltage Surge, the thing I'm really trying to hit is Rafine, which comes down on 3, and if you can tag it, you need to tag it then, cut down the same way. Rona's Vortex deals with Planeswalkers, Liliana, the Veil, floating around basically everywhere. It's a Liliana format. Other than that, 2 make disappear, 1 negate as the counterspell suite. Don't do a whole lot of countering in this game. It's not really necessary. It's once you get to the end of the game and you're really trying to dodge haymakers, that's when these come up. That or on turn 2, you can make disappear something. Other than that, you don't really want to be going out of your way. Infernal Grasp tagging the Sheoldreds, as well as Meathook Massacre being able to just sweep up the board. That's the interaction that we're working with. Then for a curve, you really want to go with Bloodtithe Harvester into Fable, the Mirror Breaker, or Corpse Appraiser.
Yeah, so you're not really playing Lily on curve? Like, that's not the plan?
Sometimes on curve. Like, the Lily's perfectly fine to play on curve. And it's, of course, a powerhouse. You just land at -2. But really, you want to play it when you can keep plussing and gaining value. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know if that's actually what happens in this game, but I feel like Liliana is so targeted in the meta for the metagame challenge that I didn't want to be leaning too heavily into it. So I was much more focused on being able to cast my vampires, my creatures, and get in for like hit for 3 every turn. Then once you get past this turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, the game kind of breaks down and you're dealing pretty much all with interaction.
Okay, yeah, I think I like it for the most part. I do have some questions. Firstly, I think, like, I'm not normally a Duress guy at all, really, but I do think that Standard right now, or at least at the time, is a Duress format. I think just getting rid of, like, hyper-efficient removal, which is pretty abundant in the format, definitely, obviously, the Planeswalkers and your Fables, your Meathook Massacres. I think Duress is good. Oddly enough, like, Duress is good, not necessarily against blue decks, I think, in this format. It's actually mid-range that it's probably going to be the best against.
I think you're right about that.
Yeah. Which I think is uncommon for typical Magic formats.
Yeah, I mean, the games just go so long with the mid-range matchups. Like, you get into a mirror in 30 turns, it's going to be a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Duress, it just tags basically everything that they have. The only thing it doesn't tag are their creatures, which aren't great,
right?
With the exception of, like, Sheoldred.
Sure. And then the other thing I noticed was only 3 Meathook Massacre.
We have one hidden over here.
Oh, in the board! I actually didn't even notice that. The reason why I ask is typically I like to err on the side of playing as many of the good cards as I can. And Meathook Massacre is maybe the best card in Standard right now. And so I was surprised you didn't just go 4 in the main. But I think 3 in the main, 1 in the side's fine. Especially in a more mid-rangey deck. Like, you're definitely not control, although I guess you could take the control role if you really wanted. But I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you think post the challenge you would have gone for 4 in the main?
After the challenge, I actually don't think I would have. I still think 3 is a great number, mostly because against control decks, which this has the potential to just lose hard to, it's a dead card. You are up against a deck that's going to only care. The only creatures that you can possibly wipe out are tokens from Wandering Emperor. Mm-hmm. You're just not going to get any value out of your Meathook Massacre. And for that, I think that 3 is a reasonable number. I don't want to shave on them too hard because they're very good. And in a format that's mostly about mid-range, it is a fine card. But it's basically playing to just sweep the board, which, if you're up against something that doesn't matter, it's not.
Right, but that also highlights the power, I think, of Fable the Mirror Breaker, in which, like, you can get kind of aggressive pre-board, because anything that's dead you can kind of cycle away.
Oh, for sure.
And did you find yourself ever... Like, I don't really play a ton of Meathook... I don't really play Meathook Massacre decks at all. Did you ever feel like you ever wanted a second one? Like, if you resolved one and then somebody started coming back, were you ever upset that... Or rather looking for another one?
Oftentimes it just sits on the board and accrues value. I feel like in some of the grindier matchups, you could want a second one. But once you land it, you normally land it in a place where you're going to be able to better than your opponent, hopefully. Mm-hmm. But again, it's a board sweeper. You know, if you're playing creatures and sweepers, you need to know how to play around that. Meathook Massacre being flexible lets you do that a little bit, but our creatures aren't huge.
Right.
We have a lot of 2 toughness creatures. The creatures that we really care about, like landing on the board with a Meathook Massacre, Sheoldred, Evelyn. Both of them work with this beautifully, just with the 5 toughness. Mm-hmm. But still, you do have the potential to basically break even on these when you get really complex board states, lots of different creatures.
Right. Oh, I mean, that makes sense. And then the other thing I was curious about was we've spent kind of a lot of time ganging on Bloodtithe Harvester as, like, kind of like an only okay
as
card.
The most mediocre card that has ever been printed.
Which honestly feels insane because it's a 2-mana 3/2 with upside. Yeah. Which, you know, traditionally in Magic would be kind of a busted card. But every time I play against this freaking card, it gets me. And, like, I want to think it's bad, but, like, do you enjoy casting it? Like, it doesn't feel better on the other side.
It feels very solid to cast. And one of the things that you can't underestimate is that this is just also a removal spell. You can get plenty of blood tokens down on the battlefield. which fuel your Voltage Surge. The Bloodtithe Harvester sits on there and just waits until you have a juicy enough creature and chomps down with the tap ability.
Right.
Also, the combo with Fable the Mirror Breaker and the combo with Evelyn the Covetous, since it's a vampire, all works together to form like a synergy that's very good in this deck, even if it's not perfect in other decks. I wouldn't just throw Bloodtithe Harvester in any deck just because it's like a very good, valuable card that puts a lot of cardboard onto the battlefield. But in this one, it's kind of hard not to play it.
Definitely. Well, I mean, yeah, you're playing vampires, so to some extent, like, you just want good vampires in there. But I think even at like outside the vampire sort of tribal decks, I've come up on it sort of reluctantly. I think it was mostly because I didn't realize you don't necessarily want to attack with it, at least when I'm playing against it. Like 2 mana 3/2 feels like a very aggressive card, but the effect is more mid-range controlling. And so I didn't really understand it at first. And then once I started playing against it, it was pretty obvious that like you could just hang out with it and -2/-2 is fine. Like if you want to sack it and kill something, which is something I didn't really realize. Because there's not a whole lot of ways to make blood in blood tokens in these decks, generally. Like even outside of this deck. So you're not really getting a crazy.
This one, it's just Bloodtithe Harvester.
Yeah, so you're not getting a crazy blood token count, which I thought like is something that you would want to do, but it seems to be valuable just with one blood token. And the other thing, the secret tech, is the Fable copy, which I definitely underestimated when I first started playing against this deck. Like being able to copy the Bloodtithe Harvester with the Fable and the Mirror Breaker and get another token, be able to sack that Bloodtithe Harvester basically for free to kill something for free. Like, that combination is very powerful.
It's so busted. It's so good. That Rakdos mid-range deck, phenomenal. You're much more used to playing it in Explorer, correct?
Definitely, yeah. That deck is a house to play against. And it's the reason why I never did have much respect for it is simply it just doesn't play a ton of good cards. But all the minor interactions within it are devastating to try to play against. Because you're screwed if you do and screwed if you don't. Like, do you kill the Bloodtithe Harvester so it doesn't get you later in the game? Or do you save your removal for something like a Sheoldred? It becomes... You just get run over by value at some point. And it feels like you can never make the right play. But I think if that's what you got... Oh, actually, let's go over the sideboard quickly, and then let's get into the games, I think. Because I'm interested to see how I'm interested to see how this deck plays out.
Yeah, generally speaking, Spell Pierce, Duress, Disdainful Stroke, Negate, those are all control matchups. Voltage Surge is if I have a specific target that I want to hit with it. For, like, if we're playing against Esper, I'll bring it in to hit Rafine. Abrade is really to deal with some problematic artifacts. I was expecting some Timeless Lotus shenanigans, but didn't really play out that way. Then Unlicensed Hearse is to deal with the graveyard strategies, especially the Jund deck. The Jund deck can really clean you up if they're able to reanimate a on turn 4. So if you land this on turn 2, they can't do that. Then Sorin, I boarded this in almost every single game because I didn't get to mention it. Jaya is a worthless planeswalker in this deck. It is garbage, and I should not have it in here. This should be 2 Sorins or 1 Sorin and 1 other random planeswalker, because this is just absolutely garbage.
What made you want to try? Were you just playing around with it in the deck?
The list that I saw, I saw a bunch of Grixis lists running this, and I thought, oh, well, if they're running it, it must be good. It pluses 1 to make a creature, it minuses 2 to... But I'd never played with the card before, and after playing with the card, realizing that the -2 doesn't really affect the board unless you're winning. The -1 is something that you want to have access with, but you need to have it already protected. And the +1 makes a meaningless creature. Like, it barely does anything.
Yeah, especially 4 mana.
Yeah, it's definitely not for this style of deck. Maybe the top end in, like, a red deck or something, but not for this.
I'll be honest, just as a quick aside, before we get into the games, I haven't, like, really looked at this Jaya much, even during spoilers and stuff. It's interesting because... its first 2 abilities are kind of flipped. typically on a 4-mana Planeswalker, you would get, its plus ability is some sort of card advantage, and then its minus ability is some sort of protection. Like if they were to use this template, and it's actually flipped in this. Its protection is the plus, and the minus is the advantage. And I think that's probably what's making it not very good. Because the play pattern at least I would typically want to see for a Planeswalker like this is land it, minus to protect it, and then you just keep plussing and accruing more and more advantage. Whereas this, you have to minus it to accrue advantage, which makes it you're reducing its health in order to try to get your effect, which obviously isn't good. Like if you look at Lily, like it does exactly the opposite. Its minus effect protects itself, and then its plus effect is value, and then you ult it. Whereas the Jaya is not doing that. You could plus it forever, but all you're getting out of it is tokens, and it's at 4 and 5 mana, you're not getting there enough, I would think.
Yeah, the tokens do not do enough for the plus, and I do think that they balanced it that because the plus made something that could protect it. The plus needed to be worse, and if that's the case, then the minus needs to be a little bit better, which it is a little bit better, but it's just not good enough.
But you agree that if the effects were flipped, it would be much better.
Oh yeah. Maybe not the exact effect. Like if they had buffed the +1, like a 2/2 monk creature or something similar to that, similar to what Sorin is.
Right, exactly.
2/3 body is not. It's very meaningful.
But that's what I'm getting at. The 2/3 bodies on the minus.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that you can minus first and then keep plussing to get to your ult and build advantage.
We're totally in agreement here.
Yeah, which is interesting. I haven't seen I can't think off the top of my head at least a Planeswalker that's like Jaya. That's built in that sort of way. But I'll be interested to see if it develops in the format at all. I think you're right, and like it could be okay in like a Spellslinger, the top end of a Spellslinger deck. But I'd imagine that the Prowess token... Does the Prowess token have haste?
Prowess token does not have haste.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I don't really see what deck this could go in.
And it's such a shame because it's such a cool token. Take a look at it. Red hands.
Yeah,
for the listeners, it's got red hands, white skin, and an arrow painted on his face.
Yeah.
You don't have to look.
Is the ult even good? Whenever you cast a red instant or sorcery spell. Nah, though I think the ult isn't even worth it. That's tough. That's unfortunate because I mean, 4-mana Planeswalkers are typically good. They're typically some of the best Planeswalkers in formats, and I don't know if this is going to get there.
If only there was a red Wandering Empire.
Basically, yeah. I mean, we'll see, right? Somebody will break this card and it'll be busted. It'll be the best card, the best deck in the format, and we'll look like idiots. But that's okay.
Or we'll look back 3 months from now and wow, Jaya really never did anything.
and then nobody will give us any credit.
Exactly.
All right, let's get into some games, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Game time.
So
DDDD.
That's
opponent's
my
name.
favorite Smash Bros. Character.
That is my Smash Bros. Main, believe it or not. I think you knew that.
I did know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
All right, so what are we playing against here?
We're playing now we're playing against Orshov, I believe. I don't know if they show up with another color. I do think that this is just Orshov mid-range.
Okay.
I like being able to keep it tight to 2 colors. The problem is with keeping it tight to 2 colors in this format is you're missing out so much value that you could have with 3 colors for absolutely no cost. No one is pressuring you because of your lands. No one is pressuring you almost at all. The only aggro deck which exists is that like Celestia Enchantments deck. Are you familiar with it at all?
I am. I played against that deck. I don't think it's very good. I've never had a ton of respect for enchantment-based strategies anyway. I think going vertical is almost always bad unless you have either something that's completely busted or a lot of protection in the format where you could just like, Tamiyo's Safekeeping or God's Willing or whatever your creatures to protect them for the cheap. But unless you have like all of that together in a format, I wouldn't think the deck the decks would end up very good.
Yeah, totally agree. The Aura's deck is phenomenal. It's very good, but it still runs into the problem where it's just like you slam removal spell, and you lose the game, right? I think that enchantments deck is just going to be such a dog to control. Blue-white control has so many tools that I just can't feasibly get myself to want to play that.
Definitely, yeah, and I don't like the idea of if the opponent has removal, I'm dead, because the opponent a lot of the times is going to have removal, and so you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. I think by making your deck weak to removal
into your deck, what are you doing?
Right,
that's part of Magic, and it's something that you need in every single deck.
Right. And so I guess that leads into my next question, actually, is where do you think the mana bases are in Standard right now?
Right now, I think that the mana bases are so good. You've got 5 tricolor lands, plus you have the Pain lands, plus you have the lack of pressure that you're feeling. So if you want to build a slower deck, you can even put gain lands in. And I mean, some of the people are even posting great results for it.
Yeah, opponent played a gain land.
Yeah, he played a gain land earlier, and it was fine because I didn't have a 1-drop that was pressuring it. And almost none of these decks do, because the 1-drops aren't impactful enough late game. Mm-hmm. And if the decks are all about mid-range mirrors, then why would you even play that? You can just have you can have whatever mana base you want and not worry about it.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think in other formats, as much as tri-lands are sweet, I've been very hesitant to put them in my decks just because them coming in tapped is such a cost if you're not a control deck. If you're a control deck, they're fine. They're great because you cycle them late. You play them basically turn 1 because you don't have anything better to do. But if you're trying to be proactive in any way, I feel like tap lands are typically pretty bad, even if they're 3 color. But if you're waiting for turn 2, 3, 4, 5 to really play your impactful stuff, I feel like tap lands are almost like a non-factor. You can kind of play whatever you want.
Yeah. In older formats, the games start on turn. In this, it always feels like the game is starting on turn 3.
Mm. And in saying that, do you think there's space for an aggro deck then in the format?
For sure. Mostly because people will become greedy. And once they become greedy, that's going to be the death knell for this style of deck. And then things will get a lot tighter. But the problem is there's not enough pressure in the world to overcome Meathook Massacre and Temporary Lockdown and all of the other
and Wandering Emperor.
Cheap sweepers. Wandering Emperor.
And Lily, for that matter. This is something that we were talking about earlier, which was... I was surprised by how much cast Lily -2 there is in Standard. Basically every Lily I played against is cast it -2 to get me to sack a creature, and then they start accruing value. Mm-hmm. Which I think is indicative of the kind of format it is. Because it's if you could just get rid of their one creature, minus it, the Lily's facing no pressure, then just continuously plus it and it's fine, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean Liliana, it's a format staple for a reason.
Right, but I think it's that way because you're not going 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, and then you Lily and -2, and then who cares, right? Because the Lily's dying anyway. Mm-hmm. This is very much play a 2-drop that either doesn't matter into a 3-drop that gets -2'd by Lily, or it's just people just dirtling around, and you don't even have to worry about the edict side. That's what at least it seems to me from the outside.
No, I mean I would totally describe Standard that way. The Planeswalkers, especially Lily, matters so much, and once you get these game pieces that keep accruing value. I mean, look at the state right now. For the audience, we have 2 blood tokens, a clue, 4 creatures. They have a Saga out. They have a Planeswalker out. Mm-hmm. The board states get very messy because there's so many different permanent types that are all interacting with each other.
Yeah, and
Planeswalkers are notoriously hard to interact with.
Yeah, and it seems like everything that enters the battlefield has an effect that you don't even care about the creature side for necessarily. Like you don't even
yeah.
necessarily care that, like we said before, that your Bloodtithe Harvester attacks. Like, of course, it's upside, but like, it's almost not in the deck for that, seemingly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's there to represent that. Oh, I could attack if I wanted to,
Right.
or but it's really there as a removal spell for things that get like out of hand, real late in the game.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about children in these lists? We have one in our hand right now.
Interesting. I think Sheoldred. I mean, there's been a lot of flack on Sheoldred, in just high level players seemingly don't seem to like it. And I understand the like what people are getting at with that. It's very much 5 mana, gain 2 life, and then it dies. But I think I've always thought the whole dies to removal thing's overblown. It's very much a thing that, like, if you don't kill it the turn it comes down, it starts to become a problem, especially in these really, really grindy matchups where, it's a 4 life swing. If you let it go to your turn, you don't deal with it, and then opponent gets to draw a card as well. And a 4 life swing on a good blocker that you also can't block yourself if they choose to attack, because of the death touch is pretty good. I mean, I think in other formats you wouldn't be playing it because there's just typically better stuff to do on 5 mana. But
That's
these
4
decks... Mana. Oh, I'm sorry, 4 mana. But these decks have a bunch of other stuff to do. Like, normally you would go, like, 2, 3, 4 of creatures, and then your 5 and 6 drops for planeswalkers, or something like that. But these decks have such efficient planeswalkers at 3 and 4, that you can wait, and Sheoldred can be your your turn 5, turn 6 play. Like here, like it's our turn 8 or 9 play, right?
Yeah,
and it's
just
totally
fine.
fine.
And it's just a big guy. He's just hanging out there.
That accrues value turn over turn until the opponent removes it.
Yeah.
Like, that accrual value, I think, is where it is. Like, the fact that it's a 4 mana 4/5 with death touch is whatever. The fact that you can land it, block, and accrue inevitability.
It needs to be answered. It needs to be answered every single time it lands on the battle. And the thing is, it also makes it tougher to find answers for. If you're digging through your deck for answers, you're taking 2 damage every single time you dig. If you're playing a blue deck, that's terrible. The bounce spells you can find, the 4 fading hopes that are in the deck in mono blue or whatever you're playing against a resolved shield, that's a death knell. If you play consider, and then draw another 2 cards, you took 8 damage, you're losing the game. Sorry.
Yeah, and it's definitely also the kind of thing where, because it's a must answer threat that has inevitability if you just leave it on the battlefield, it taxes the opponent even more. Like, it diverts their attention from killing you. Like, that's what I think a lot of these mid-range decks are doing. Like, everything you play is something that's going to be a problem later in the game. And so it diverts your attention from killing opponent or killing a planeswalker to, oh, I got to get rid of Sheoldred and Bloodtithe Harvesters and whatever else you play, on top of there being a Lily or a Sorin, on top of trying to have to kill you. Right? Like, every layer of protection there is important to trying to win the game. And if there's too many things that the opponent has to deal with, even if they're not awesome in and of themselves, like, it's just too many distractions to try to win the game.
Definitely. And the best threats that you can put on the battlefield that are doing that sort of accruing value, putting down different types of permanents, or doing life total damage like Sheoldred, are ones that are tough to interact with. Like we were just talking about planeswalkers that were tough to interact with. The best interaction for Sheoldred are cards like Infernal Grasp. But the problem is, if you want that, you have to put Infernal Grasp in your deck, and all it does is one thing: kill 1 creature. Meanwhile, you have Bloodtithe Harvester making a body, making a blood token, getting to attack, getting to kill a creature. Or your planeswalkers, which are able to just plus and minus and do whatever, you have to take one of those that are accruing value out of your deck in order to fit in the interaction, which deals with the opponent.
Yep, and it's just a 1-for-1 at the end of the day.
Yep.
If you go to kill the Sheoldred, which is crazy to say because it's standard. Like, I don't know if other standard formats have been like this. I mean, the completely broken ones are completely broken, but typically in standard, like, 1-for-1s are mostly fine, especially killing a Sheoldred with an Infernal Grasp, like killing a 4-mana creature with a 2-mana card, is typically good. But to your point, because the Infernal Grasp isn't doing anything other than killing the Sheoldred or whatever you choose to point at it, it's just you're losing cards.
Totally agree. That's one of the reasons why I love this standard so much. Having so much fun when normally you and I are both much more Eternal format players. It's because the card efficiency in Eternal are very fun to play with, right? Mm-hmm. You get to do very powerful things, and you get to interact with the opponent from the first get-go, and get to do things that are actually interesting in the game. This Negating is very similar, but of course, negate the Lily.
Yeah, that's what it's in the deck for.
What other targets do we have? Do you have Gonjo in their hand? No, ridiculous. I do not respect Restoration of
the I can see why.
But like I was saying, I think that the way that Standard does efficiency is just different from the way Eternal Formats does efficiency. Instead of it being cards that are really cheap that do the best thing you could possibly do, it's cards that do 8 different things pretty poorly. Restoration of Aganjo is a 3-mana card that searches up a land and then gets a land back onto the battlefield, or 2-drop, something silly, and then it turns into a creature. That's not playable in Eternal. That's because it just doesn't do anything super powerful, but it does 8 different things. So it's playable in Standard, and it's a very different kind of valued in.
Yeah, and I think that's a mostly new design concept. Not that I'm like super into like the nitty-gritty game design stuff that Wizards does for Magic, but I think it like at different times Standard wasn't doing this.
Oh yeah.
I just think the card designs are different, and it's. I mean, we've had this conversation before too, especially in Limited, with just cards getting progressively more complicated, which I don't think is inherently bad, but it definitely changes the kind of formats you play in for Constructed, even though it's mostly a limited concern.
I also just think it's difficult to do. It's difficult to do well, and I don't begrudge them their job being able to like. It's tough. Right? Like, look at Ledger Shredder. Beautifully simplistic. Whenever you cast 2 spells, you draw one, discard one.
Yeah.
Real simple, but it still does something super efficient. To get that kind of thing out of a card that's much less iconic, it's tough to do without like a bunch of different text.
Definitely. Yeah. And limitations. Like there are some abilities that only trigger at sorcery speed. There are some abilities that only target certain things. Like to your point, you need more text in order to do that, in order to balance it properly. But it seems like
the training wheels has its cost, of course.
But it looks like if it seems to you they've successfully created a format that you're enjoying.
Oh yeah, I am loving Standard now, and I was reading Standard like the past year, which might be partially because it felt a little bit like a normal Standard, but that's the thing. I mean, this feels like you're very things and having to like analyze these different things. Maybe I just wasn't able to find that decks that were available to me in Standard.
Yeah, I also think that like the previous standards were pretty broken in a way that like, I mean, I would still keep up with Magic content, obviously, so I would tangentially interact with Standard. Not play, but just see what other people are into in Standard. And a lot of times I would like look over and be like, what the fuck is happening to Standard? Like, why is Alrund's Epiphany like constantly casting it, getting a million turns, Hullbreaker Horror, like Goldspan Dragon? Like, what the hell is going on over there? And now it at least seems from the outside to be like a just normal Magic format, which I think puts it in a good spot. Ironically, it seems like not a ton of people are playing it. It seemed like a lot more people were playing, the Alrund's Epiphany stuff when that was doing its thing, and Omnath like a couple years ago than are now. But from the sounds of it, it seems like that will change. If it truly is a pretty cool format.
The problem is there's also just no competitive incentive to do it. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people on standard playing standard in the Magic Arena, but there's no RCQs that are holding standard events because there's no local stores that are holding RCQs in standard because there's no competitive events for standard as time goes on. And then
who's even playing?
If you're not doing that.
Who's even playing paper standard?
Yeah.
Like, standard's almost an arena-only format at this point, it seems.
Just about. I mean, like, it's totally gone on MidGo. It's totally in paper. You have to keep spending hundreds of dollars on cards. Why not just play the cards that you already spent hundreds of dollars on?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And all of this is to say, goes without saying, pales in comparison to Commander, which is a huge moneymaker.
God, I hate Commander. This might be one of the...
what goes on. Go ahead.
Yeah, who would? All I know is that they complain about everything, seemingly. Yeah. But that's beside the point. I've played one game of Commander in my entire life. It was actually with you at college when we played with our floor mates.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I did not like it. I didn't like it. I was like, why am I sitting around playing for 3 hours in a game that seems lost? But that's besides the point. This is not a Commander complaints podcast.
No, of course
or
not.
Pod and Play, rather. A new format that we're designing.
Pod and Play. This is the playing that we're... Why don't we pay attention to the game for a little bit? Because right now, we just took out a Lisa that has been plaguing us this entire game. Mm-hmm. So we ditched an Ertai earlier, the 4-mana enters the battlefield, kill a creature, to try and look for better removal, mostly leaning on the fact that we have hand.
Yeah, I've been waiting for you to channel it for like a while now, actually. I'm like,
oh, yeah.
I'm like, he should not... So we also have blood tokens on the battlefield, and I thought you were planning on cycling away this Otawara. But that didn't seem to happen. What? Did you not choose to crack it there?
Yeah, I chose not to crack it. I didn't want to spend all of my... I didn't want to spend my treasures on it, and I also didn't want to spend my blood tokens looking for a card that's just going to get dumped by the Court of Victory.
Well, yes. Yeah, of course.
If I bounce the Architect side of the Ganja we're just talking about, then you could just play that and gain more value with it after you've gotten enough value. Mm-hmm. And if I were to just use it on, use it on a random thing like Bankbuster, anything on their board enters the battle.
Right.
I really can't let them do that this far back in the game.
Definitely.
Yeah. But what the plan was for Lisa, and the reason why I was holding that Ganja, was I can certainly find a way to kill it with the 2/3. The 3/2. The Bloodtithe Harvester.
Harvester, right.
Which I did eventually do, finding Meathook Massacre later on in the game. And I generally wasn't really... maybe I should feel more threatened by that card, but I was taking 4 damage in the air, and it was just sort of sitting there. It was able to buy back a card a couple times, but other than that, it didn't get me to the point where I'm still going to lose this game, even though I'm very much on the back foot. We're pretty close on actual cards.
Right, and that actually gets that gets to our previous point about the format, which is like you almost don't care about your life total because you just want to be doing as much as you possibly can with the cards in your hand, and as long as you're still alive, maximizing your cards is what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Seemingly, you were holding out on stuff for quite a while just to get maximum value from them. It seems to be mostly working. I mean, you've stabilized and you have a bunch of cardboard on the field, so it seems to have worked. Even if you lose, you put yourself in a good position.
And that's really what you have to do. Just keeping the value train rolling. All of the more pieces of cardboard you have on the back, the better you are as a person.
As a man, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
This actually leads very nicely into one of my pre-prepared podcast topics, which we can get into now if you want.
Yeah, for sure. Let's cue it up.
Yeah, so for the benefit of the listener, I have written down some notes I've learned playing Magic, and obviously I'm still learning to get better. But this topic is basically going to be the different levels of thinking of board states and of advantage, and basically just what the game is about. From at least when I was a beginner to where I am now, and hopefully this list gets built upon. It's just different ways of thinking about the game. So the first way, I think, the first trap we all fall into when we first learn the game is that life is important, and that life totals are important. And at least for me, I tended to overvalue life gain cards, just because in my head the differential was what was important and not killing your opponent. And really, like, in my head at the time, it was healing salve or whatever, the gain 3 life, right, instant. Felt the same. The same level of advantage as lightning bolt, because it was like, oh well, I'm gaining 3 life. Lightning bolt forces the opponent to lose 3 life, but at the end of the day, it's a life differential of 3, and so they're similar. I'm not saying that I ever thought lightning bolt and healing salve were equal cards, but in my head that effect was somewhat equivalent. And then you realize that gaining life isn't actually the point, or rather even life differential is not the point. You have to kill your opponent somehow, right? And so by playing a card that doesn't push you towards that plan, it means it's a card that's not really doing anything. So that was the first way. So life totals and comparing life totals is the first level of thinking in Magic. And it's sort of the joke that we make that's like, you start the game, opponent plays Shockland, you're like, I'm winning because it's 20 to 18. Like, if you think of life total as points, then it may seem like that. I think a lot of beginning players do that. I know I did, as thinking of life totals as points. Then that gets to the next thing, which is board state. That's at least the next thing that I started to understand. I started to understand that, having creatures feels good because creatures deal damage and creatures block. And and at the time I'm like, that's what the game is about. You play creatures, you swing, you block. It's a game based on board state. And if I had more creatures, or if I had more power on the battlefield, more numbers, then I was winning the game, even if the life totals were a little different. And I think for the most part, that's not entirely wrong, but it takes away like most of the other decks and formats, right? Like big green decks or whatever creature-based aggro decks exist in formats, and they're good, but they're only a small percentage of what's actually happening. And it completely discounts different strategies like control, which some control decks don't play any creatures, and things like that. And those decks win, and they win a lot. So if they're winning but they don't have creatures, then creatures and board state mustn't matter as much as I think it does, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or at least at the time. So that went to the next layer, which for me was removal, right? Which is what we were talking about before, which was, well, I got this great plan. My opponent wants to play a bunch of creatures and kill me. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to play a bunch of removal spells and not allow that to happen, and I'll figure out a way to win some other time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also sort of a logical fallacy, because if you just play a deck full of removal spells, you're not killing the opponent. So I'm going to take a quick break there. Is there anything in that you'd like to respond to in any way?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like working your way up the ladder of the different deck style, the different most common deck styles. Like starting out with the most important thing being life total, being like a 0 level deck of the life game deck.
Right.
Just a joke. But but then moving up to board state based being aggro, value base being mid range. Well, I suppose that would be the next step past there. Then control being the game that cares most about interaction and making sure your opponent can't do anything. And the two very simple ways of thinking about it can make for really interesting gameplay styles. Like half of the decks that exist in the world, control and aggro. which have very linear strategies at times. But being linear doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad deck or something that's not an interesting deck to play, right?
I suppose that's true, but I think the what I'm actually getting at is that if you think games are about life total, or if you think games are about board state, you're not considering the other parts of the game. Like, you can't. It's the whole. What's the player archetype that likes big creatures? It's Timmies, right?
Yeah, Timmies. Yeah.
Like, Timmies aren't typically good at Magic, right? Because they're like, I'm going to put giant creatures on the battlefield. I'm going to win the game, and that's just not how games work. And so these and just like thinking I have more life than the opponent, therefore I'm ahead, and I'm probably going to win this game, also doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And so there are different. There's of course a point where, opponent has 1 life, I have a million life. I'm probably going to find a way to win this game, but the game is not about that, in my opinion. Now that I've spent years in the game and understand, you can't just look at life totals to understand who's winning. You can't just look at board state to understand who's winning.
To me, the most important thing to look at to understand who's winning is game plan and contrasting game plan. So that is all matchup dependent. The most archetypical example of this is aggro versus control. Aggro has the game plan of get you dead the quickest, and control has the game plan of run you out of resources. Whoever wins that game is able to make the game about what they care about and not what the other person cares about. And that's really all the game is. When it's the mid-range matchup, it's who can cast more spells or who can be the bigger mid-range deck, really. When it's mid-range versus aggro, it's can I not die before I'm bigger than them and have a bigger presence? And not die to reach, of course. That's the idea that permeates all of these different games. It's all, can I make the game about what I want to do to win? And if that's and you play cards based on how much they push you towards that game plan and stop the opponent from going towards their game plan. Control decks lean toward stop the opponent from. But that's not necessarily the way. Look at the 4-color control deck in Modern. It's able to just slam so many valuable cards onto the back and accrue enough value that it's basically a tap-out control deck. That's not the way that draw control is normally played, or the way that you normally think about a control deck. But really, you're just trying to run your opponents out of value while you assemble different combos on the side. This is like a hardline aggro deck may have things that still interact with the opponent. For example, the Scam deck in Modern runs Thoughtseize, which is able to see and hand to the grab a card. That's not something that gets your opponent deader quicker, but it is something that stops their game. So it's all just about trying to force your plan without having the opponent force their game.
Right, I'm glad.
Linear. Yep,
I'm glad you said it that way, because I actually I thought about it in a very different way, but came to the same conclusion. Which is, not only is it about game plan, but for me, it's about life pressure differential, which I know is like a very technical way of saying it, but I thought it was pretty funny that it was circular. Like my first level of thinking was about the game's about life total, and the way I am now is it's about life pressure, which is essentially, to your point, exactly what you're talking about right now. An aggro deck wants to exert as much life pressure as it possibly can, because it needs you dead as soon as possible, because it's not going to be able to keep up with card advantage and some other things. Whereas a control deck, even though it's not playing creatures, it can stem the tide of life pressure, or a successful control deck can stem the tide of life pressure of an aggro deck by not playing creatures necessarily, but by blocking, or, you can play creatures, but defensive creatures, removal spells, wraths, so that eventually you're reducing your opponent's life pressure to 0, because they've run out of creatures on the board, and you've presumably run them out of cards. And so any level of life pressure that you can apply to them is positive life pressure, and you're winning the game. And so, I mean, the most obvious example, or in-your-face example of that is like the Castle Arnvale control deck, Azorius control deck from historic, however long ago that was. which was literally like it seemed like the point of the deck was land Teferi and then play Castle Ardenvale to make 1/1 tokens, and you die for
beat down for the rest of the
game.
And
you die to tokens. And it sounds ridiculous because you're like, how am I losing to 1/1 tokens? But in reality, what's happening is they're exerting positive life pressure on you. Right? You have no cards in hand. You're not exerting any pressure on them. They have 1/1s, which are ridiculous, but it's still pressure, and you're going to lose to that. Whereas an aggro deck is exerting a lot of positive life pressure onto you very early, and your job is to try to reduce that life total pressure as much as you can in order to turn the corner and run them out of resources and exert your own life total pressure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And it also explains a lot of things that happen when you get into game states that involve these different types of decks. So like the aggro versus aggro matchup where you're racing, that's life pressure differential, right? That's exactly what you're talking about. The control versus control matchup is not about landing, it's about landing something that can put the pressure on without having to worry about the interaction. So either running them out of cards, which is more difficult, or landing something that's like a mirror breaker, the Sphinx of Insight, or just chipping in with a 1/1. If you have the Castle Ardenvale and they don't, probably better off.
Right, and this also explains why different deck types still work, because to your point, their plan is still about either exerting their own pressure or reducing the opponent's pressure in some way. So the basis line way of thinking about this is just the ideal aggro deck is 20 mountains and 40 lightning bolts, right? So that means on average, every card in your deck is worth, 2 damage?
Yeah, that's true.
Right? And so you can go, if you're trying to combat this kind of deck, you can go about it many different ways. You could do, discard by reducing the amount of cards in your hand is reducing the amount of life pressure you can deal the opponent because you simply don't have the cards. Counter spells can keep life pressure off of you until you get your game plan going, can exert more life pressure onto them than they have in their hand, and things like that. And like you were saying, like life pressure doesn't have to be stuff on the battlefield. If I'm a control deck and I have 5 cards in hand, and you're an aggro deck and you have 1 card in hand, I probably have the ability to exert more life pressure on you than you do me, even though you have a creature on the battlefield. Because just based on odds, I probably have, by having 5 cards in my hand, I have enough ways of getting rid of your creature, getting rid of your card in hand, and exerting my pressure on you.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at now. In terms of,
it's definitely a good way of thinking about the game, and it mirrors the same thing that I was talking about, sticking to your game plan and being able to force your game plan. I guess the question comes with this life pressure differential discussion. Where is the level up in this? Like, are you playing differently because of this this information? Are you building your decks differently because of this information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it goes hand in hand with my one of the level ups that I've had, not recently, but within, I would say, the past year, is the whole Who's the Beatdown level up. Mm-hmm. And it was this is a very famous Magic article from 1999 that I've actually only recently explicitly read.
Which
plenty
is
of people,
shocking, but
yeah, but plenty of people talk about it, and I it's easy to understand the concept, and it's not as easy to actually implement. And so reading the article opened my eyes a little bit, but I don't think you'd have to explicitly read it if you don't want to. But it's a very short article. Maybe it's 1,000 words. It's probably more like 500 words. And the reason why I say that in terms of life pressure differential was I was not fully respecting what it meant to assign yourself the control role or assign yourself the aggro, the beatdown role. Right? So at the time, and this goes hand in hand with another level up I had kind of at the same time, which is you have a plan when you build the deck, and then you have a plan when you play the deck. And those plans can be totally different, completely opposite. And you might build an aggro deck, and then you put it in, you go to play somebody, and they have an even faster aggro deck. you can't race that deck. That's not what you should be doing, which is what I was doing before, right? So what I was doing was I was still, when I was playing the deck, I was still abiding by some of the tenets I was using when I was building the deck, which is just incorrect in my opinion. They should be two completely different and separated plans. Now, obviously, turn one, or when you're going against a deck you're unfamiliar with or whatever, you should stick as closely as possible to your deck building plan, just because that's what your deck is designed to do. But as soon as it becomes obvious to you that you need to become the control side of a matchup, or the aggro side of a matchup, you need to do that, and you need to do it in a very extreme way, or at least more extreme than I was doing. Mm-hmm. I typically play more aggressive focus decks. If I often think of aggression in terms of just simply speed from 1 to 10, where 1 is the most aggressive aggro deck and 10 is the most controlling control deck. I typically play 3s or 4s probably, and it's difficult to get your mind to switch because you're in your head, you need to be attacking. You're like, attacking is the way I win this game with a 3 or with a speed 3 or 4 aggro deck, aggro / mid range. And when you're going up against a speed 2 aggro deck, you have to chump a lot. Like, I was giving away creatures that I thought were like, I wasn't willing to chump with my unflipped Delver, for instance, against an aggro deck.
Which,
and then
their 1/1s are so much valuable than just a Delver out on the field.
Right, and even outside of trading, just straight up chumping. I just chumped a lot more once I started understanding this concept, because I knew the longer the game was going to go and the more I could preserve my life total, I just have better cards in my deck. I just need to be able to play them, right? And that's the thing. I mean, an aggro deck typically, unless you're in a super broken format, the aggro decks are giving up card quality for life pressure. And so I knew if my 3 drops and my 4 drops were going to be better than whatever random 2 drop the aggro deck had, I just needed to get there. And once I started really taking this beat down to control decision more seriously and committing to that decision in a more extreme way, I started to see results for this exact life pressure reason.
Yep. I think that's it's a great lesson to take away from it, and it's something that makes you play decks totally different. And Definitely. It's one of the things that you can get as a pilot and not just as a as a deck builder. Like, playing a deck takes as much skill as it does building. Both of them are totally separate skills that come into sort of confluence when you're playing the game, which is interesting, of course. But the mid-range matchups that we're talking about earlier are also great examples that we can use to picture this idea that you can take into every single game of Magic. The mid-range games, like we were talking about with game plan, they come at different speeds, and you may build your deck to be a different speed. You never want to be the deck that's doing the smaller thing. And the way that these strategies are playing out, especially in Standard, with the decks that we were talking about, the Jund deck, the Grixis deck, playing against an Esper deck on the screen now, if you're doing something that's powerful, then you're going to be exerting this life pressure differential. We just won a race on the screen by exerting more of that pressure with 3 cards in hand. We were able to get under, and knowing when you can get under and knowing when to go over and wait it out, that's super important. He could have stopped. He could have stopped attacking. He had a 6/8 on the battlefield. He didn't need to attack there. Yep. But he's playing the deck in a way that he designed the deck in his head. I am a tempo deck. I slam my Rafine into the other opponent.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I would do, right? Like, I would be like, I flip Delver, I have to keep swinging, and it's like, you don't actually.
No, actually, you don't. It does not have the Dragon's Rage handler.
Right. And I mean, this became obvious to me like when I had good card advantage spells in my tempo deck, which is like, hey, like, we could just chump a bunch of stuff and trade off all of my early game, and Expressive Iteration is going to win me this game, for instance. Like, expressive iteration on turn 5 is like the best top deck you can possibly have, because you can fit this card in your aggro deck or your tempo deck, but when you're in the control when you're in the control role in a matchup, it allows you to regain your life pressure, because you've spent the entire first part of the game killing everything with unholy heats and countering stuff, and this is in a deck that's supposed to be swinging. Like, my tempo decks are supposed to attack turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. But when you have to play control, you have to play control. You have to commit to it. Mm-hmm. And so your plan becomes Unholy Heat everything, Jawari Disruption their turn 2, maybe try to counter their turn 3, then Expressive Iteration, right? And notice I haven't, in this hypothetical, I haven't played a creature in an aggro deck on turn 4. I still haven't played a creature yet.
Yeah.
Then you Expressive Iteration, refill. Now we start exerting our life pressure on the opponent, now that they've spent 3 or 4 cards, now that we've traded 3 or 4 cards off and I've refilled, and they presumably can't because they're an aggro deck. And now we start to be able to exert our game plan on them. It's still ultimately the same game plan, right? It's still Resolve Delver, flip it, protect it, swing. That game plan is just starting on turn 4 or turn 5 instead of on turn 1. And that's because I've chosen to immediately accept the control role and play to the control role. Granted, you're playing a terrible control deck, right? Like, I don't have any planeswalkers. I don't have any huge spells that are going to win me the game. And if you said I'm going to play this as a control deck all the time, it would suck. But in this matchup, that's what you have to do.
In the situation, and situational is the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And putting yourself in a mindset where you're going to just be accepting the same thing over and over and doing the same play patterns puts you in a position to lose, where
definitely
you could be winning by just playing differently and taking a different, and realizing in a game that it's not necessarily one way to play out a turn. There's 8 different ways to play out a turn, and all of it depends on your game plan going into it. That's a game-changing thing. Mm-hmm. With specifically choosing who's the beatdown and who's the control. Is it important to just look at the matchup? Is it important to think about exactly is it just knowing what deck the opponent's playing? How do you really assess that?
Yeah, well, that's a bunch of different level ups all at once. Like, I do think the state I'm at now is the culmination of a bunch of level ups that happened that I knew at the time, but I didn't become better until I put them all together. So just like you were saying, who's the beatdown is going to be matchup dependent to some extent. But there are some times when I'm playing against, I keep using the aggro deck as the example because it's the most obvious, because I think it's the most difficult to play an aggro deck in the control role, because you so want to attack, but you shouldn't. Anyway, there are times when an aggro deck will go, Mountain Go, right? When they're on the play. And there are times when I'm like, I just have I have an aggressive tempo hand, and I'm like, we're gonna run over this aggro deck because they're not starting until turn 2. They don't have a ton of removal typically, and their removal is typically reserved for going face, or rather their burn spells are typically reserved for going face. And so even if you force them to use their burn spell on a creature, you're taking life pressure away from them. And it's just like, I'm going to roll over this deck because they're not going to have enough answers, right? They have no sweepers. Their target removal is dubious, and I'm just going to win. And being the beatdown in an aggro matchup, right, where I'm presumably the slower deck. So it takes... and this is where your keep mold decisions become super important. If you're in a matchup where you think you should be the control, but they present you an opportunity to be the beatdown, and you have a hand that can support that, you have to make that decision early. And it's not just, I'm the tempo deck against an aggro deck, I need to be the control no matter what. It's very starting hand dependent. It's very, what outs do you have dependent. Which is, you may peel a hand that's like, this is 1 land away, and if you think you need to be the beatdown in in whatever matchup you are in, you may need to keep that hand, right? And say, like, I'm going to be the beatdown. I need to draw a land off the top. And if it happens, you're going to win. And you just need to make that decision, I think. But that goes along with also your point of you need to have a plan and you need to stick to it. If you decide to be the beatdown, you have to be the beatdown.
that's your game plan when you do. Absolutely. With the I'll say specifically relating to like games like this and other what am I trying to say? So the big takeaway from looking at how this could change your gameplay and what you're looking to do is being flexible about game states and what role you play in different game states based on both the matchup, like the example you gave, mono red, you're playing against a mono red deck with blue tempo deck, right? Mm-hmm. The cards in your hand, how you're playing them out, so that would be number 2, the cards in your hand. And then, of course, number 3, what's the board state look like? Because you need to know when to be able to turn into the aggressive beatdown once you've turned the corner, once you've been able to play against this deck to the point where they're out of resources and they can't do anything to you. You add that one piece of positive life pressure, and that's all based on like 4 different things that go into it.
Right, and this also feeds back into deck building, right? Like, it's all obviously circular. Just because your game plan with your deck building and your game plan in the game are separate, it doesn't mean that these are 2 separate states. So what I mean by that is, and what I was thinking of when you were saying that is, you also need to play to your outs, right? Like, if you can't be the aggro, you can't choose the aggro role if you don't have any aggression. It's just an impossibility, right? So when you're building a deck, these are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about. If I'm I've built my deck to be an aggro deck, for instance, but you have to think, if I'm not the beatdown, what cards are going to help me in that role? If you're building an aggro deck, unless it's the most aggro-y aggro deck you can build, and you're never going to be the control in any matchup, if there are some amounts of time that you're going to be the control, then you need control-ish cards. And I'm not saying you need to put counterspells in your aggro deck. That's not what I'm saying. Or sweepers in your aggro deck. What I'm saying is cards like Light Up the Stage, which is a card advantage spell if you deal damage to the opponent, is the kind of thing that could help you in your control matchups in an aggro deck, right? Like the matchups where you need to be the control. Because you're trading off resources, even though it's a bad 3 mana, it's basically divination, right? That you can't even keep the cards. You have to play them within your next 2 turns. That's still a card that's going to accrue you value when you're the control in an aggro matchup.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
There's a give and take. Yeah, absolutely. There's a give and take between types of spells that you're going to be playing in your deck. So Light Up the Stage is a good example, which feeds into both game plans that you're talking about.
Exactly.
But you're always going to have to make the decision sometimes, am I going to be picking a card because it negates the life pressure total from the opponent or the game plan pressure that they're putting on? So am I going to play something that is good against control but doesn't speed the clock very quickly? A card like a 2-mana white card that can become indestructible.
Yeah, or like Mystical Dispute.
Exactly.
Like that's a very common decision that I have to make in that tempo deck. Just for instance, which is, am I going to take something that's explicitly good against a blue control deck? Mystical Dispute turns into the best counterspell in my deck, or do I need to be better at being the beatdown? Mm-hmm. And this is a decision you have to make during deck building and during boarding. I'm sorry to cut you off, but that was just a very poignant example of what you were just talking about.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Where that's the type of decision you would make during building that bears fruit in these sort of situations where you do need to be flexible. Historic, I for a very long time had a mono black aggro deck, which was playing Phyrexian Obliterator, and Phyrexian Obliterator is one of those cards that has a role, and that role is to be a control, right? So you could be playing a mono black aggro. You're slamming a creature on 1, slamming a creature on 2, slamming discard spells, slamming other things which sort of forward your game plan. But sometimes you do need a dirtily 4-mana 5/5 that can just stonewall any of them. And that's the thing. When you build the deck, you need to look at that flexibly and say, is this worth the cut to speed?
Definitely. And I also think that those cards that can play both sides of the matchup, just like Phyrexian Obliterator, just like something like Expressive Iteration, are the best cards typically in formats, and typically the best card in your deck, right? So Phyrexian Obliterator plays both sides, right? It could be just the 4-mana blow your opponent out when you're just swinging out. They're fighting. It's a game of, maybe they've killed a couple of your creatures, or they chump, and now you have a Phyrexian Obliterator, and they can't block. They can't chump it because then they just lose everything. They need to have a removal spell, and it might just be the thing that you swing out with to win the game. The flip side of that is you're playing the control role. You're the one that's trading things off from attackers. Now you play your Phyrexian Obliterator. Now they can attack, unless they have lethal, obviously, through your Phyrexian Obliterator. And the same card at the same point in your mana curve is doing both things. And that's where the deck building edges combine with your gameplay edges to make you a better player, in my opinion. I think we should go into our famous last segment here.
I'll tell you what, this is my favorite type of segment.
Which is the way that we've decided to preliminarily at least end our episodes, which is very simply, is it historic legal? There are many times when Lucas and I are building decks where one of us will bring up a piece of tech and we're like, I didn't even know that existed in historic. And there are plenty of cards like this. So the way I'm thinking of doing this is I'm going to give you 3 options.
Okay.
And you have to find the card. Either I'll give you the option. Do you want to find the card that's historic legal or find the card that's not?
I will find the card that is not historic legal.
That is not historic legal?
Not historic legal.
Ooh. Okay. Ready for your options.
Oh, I'm ready.
Okay. Card 1, Bedevil. And let me know if you need me to read any of these. Actually, I'll read them for the
read them for the audience.
For the audience, yeah. So it's a.
Wait. Can I try and read them for the audience? Even though I'm not looking at the card.
Mm-hmm.
Bedevil, black, red, destroy target creature or planeswalker.
Artifact creature or planeswalker, but very good.
Oh, okay.
Whoops. Next card. Bizarre Trade Mage.
Bizarre Trade Mage. I have no idea what that does.
That is a 3-mana, 2 and a blue from Original Modern Horizons. It is a 3/4 human wizard with flying. And whenever Bizarre Trade Mage enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards, then discard 3 cards.
Oh, like that's the Bizarre Baghdad text.
Yep.
Okay.
Firstly, do you think it's even good?
Do I think it's good? I mean, I haven't.
Just by description.
Not. It's 3. How much is it? How much does it cost?
2 and a blue.
2 and a blue.
It's a 3/4 wizard with flying, and then you draw 2, ditch 3.
Draw 2, ditch 3. I think it's too expensive to see play.
Interesting. Third card
in historic.
Oh. Third card.
The wizard. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Bonfire of the Damned. Do you have any idea what this card does?
Nope. I have no idea.
It's relatively famous. It's from Avacyn Restored. It's an XX red sorcery with Bonfire of the Damned deals X damage to target player and each creature he or she controls. But the tech is it's got Miracle for X and a red. which means that if you draw it, you get to the turn you draw it, you get to pay its miracle cost, and the miracle cost will typically have other effects. So
I'm familiar with how to play the miracle cards. Okay.
So just to go over, Bedevil, Bizarre Trade Mage, or Bonfire of the Damned, which one is not historic legal?
Okay. I will have to go with Bonfire of the Damned.
Okay.
Because there are no miracle cards on Arena yet. I was looking into it a little bit. I typed it into the bar.
You cheated!
A month ago.
Well, that's very correct. The reason why I chose these 3 cards specifically is I was actually really surprised that Bizarre Trade Mage is historic legal.
Yeah. Oh, I did remember that card.
I didn't know that. I didn't realize that there was a Modern Horizons card other than like Darcy or whatever that is historic legal. And I thought I would have seen this card come up at some point. But I guess not.
Actually, the Jumpstart, the second Jumpstart set that Historic had was called Jumpstart Historic Horizons, and they put in about 1 million Modern Horizons cards.
Right, and
from like one and 2. Yeah.
And to your point, I didn't see all of them. I know there's like there's some affinity ones and stuff. Like Thought Monitor, I think is in there. It was from that set, but yeah, I didn't know Bizarre Trade Mage was in there. Funnily enough, the cube that I did a couple weeks ago picked a Bizarre Trade Mage. It was pretty good, believe it or not.
All right. I believe it. I mean, it enters the battlefield in cube. Oh, that's the perfect card that you want to draw.
Definitely
draws you some cards. Looks big body, 3 mana, flying.
Yeah. Perfect. Plus, it was a pretty low-powered cube, so ditching some of your crappy cards for the chance of getting a better card, even though you're 2 for 3ing yourself, was pretty good. All right, I think that'll do it for our first episode of. Do we have an official name for this, or is this just the Play&Pod? UCAPOG's Play&Pod.
You see a pair of goblins Play&Pod.
That's too hard to say. UCAPOG Play&Pod.
You see the Pog Play Pod.
Well, there you go. Lock it in. That's the name. It's never changing ever again.
No, we're definitely not changing it next week. Putting a different title in the video. All right. I've been Lucas.
I have been UCAPOG Dan. This is our sign-off. See you later.
Keep gaming, guys.
Keep playing Magic.
We need like a hard cut at some point. Like maybe
editor, just cut there.